and welcome to Global South Rising. Sorry, what is with this? I apologize. I don't know what happened here. Okay. Hi, and welcome to Global South Rising, where we break down the weekly news from around the world through an anti-imperialist lens every week on Friday, 9 a.m. BRT, 12 p.m. UTC, and 8 p.m. Beijing. We dismantle we dismantle our cameras, but we also dismantle imperial narratives with analysis, opinion, and in-depth discussion on the challenges, achievements, and contradictions of building a new multilateral world. Or a multipolar world through multilateralism. Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Ileana Chan, and with my co-host, Sara Vivacqua. Hi, Sara. How are you today?
Hi, I'm fine. Very happy to be here with you. Now I'm in London, so very glad with the perspective of meeting you on Saturday. And
Yes.
a lot of things going on in the world. I don't think we'll be never having a break here. Very, very happy to be talking about Cuba today. I think it's very important.
Yes.
There is a gasification of Cuba, I guess.
Cuba, we have a pre-recorded interview that we will react to. We'll be playing it and reacting to it, and of course responding to any comments in the comment section with the filmmaker Eduardo Flores Torres that just came back from Cuba. I just want to say hi to some of the commenters in the chat box. Hello to Sydney, Australia, Italo. My gosh. I think I never get that right, but thank you for coming back. I recognize that name. I really appreciate the support. And of course, Rafael from Brazil. And then we have Invent the Future from London.
Oh, really? Who is that?
Ooh, I wonder who that is. For people who don't know, that is Carlos Martinez, friend of the show. He will be on the show next week. And he has just started his own YouTube channel, Invent the Future. So click on that. I think it can actually take you to his own YouTube channel, which is a very important YouTube channel with a lot of very important insights. Of course, Carlos Martinez is the co-founder of Friends of Socialist China. So he knows a lot about China. And he also has written that book that we like showing a lot. This book, really, really essential reading for people who want to know more about China. So.
And Ileana, I have to say, this channel was blocked by Google, was censored by Google, and had to begin from scratch. So it's very important that people subscribe, and go to the channel to sabotage Google's censorship. And I think maybe you want to announce a seminar that you're going to be in. You're going to be in the China Maxim, maybe?
Yeah, we totally could. Yeah. But first, I also want to say hi to Hakeem Mohammed from Fort Wayne, Indiana. So we actually have someone joining us from the U.S. as well, which is nice. And I'm going to show this really nifty flyer from Friends of Socialist China. I'm going to be chairing this. I'm very excited about chairing it because I'm also nervous. I don't know why even though we do this every week, I feel nervous about chairing. Isn't that funny? Why am I nervous about chairing?
Well, a lot of big names.
Oh yeah, a lot of people that I've actually interviewed. Of course, Carlos I've interviewed, but I'm gonna show this. Hopefully, this will not happen. But here I'm gonna share my screen, and we can see what that is. Because yes, it's very impressive. So here it is, the webinar, Socialist China Maxing, How China's Achievements Are a Product of Its Socialist System. So this will be on Sunday, 12th April 2026, this year, obviously, 3 p.m. Britain, 10 a.m. US Eastern, and 10 p.m. China. It's pretty late for China, and it's pretty cool. Look at the lineup here. We've got George Galloway, who I was on his show.
Yeah, I remember that.
I have interviewed Li Jingjing twice, Chen Huihua. I've interviewed him as well. He's the former China Daily EU bureau chief. Ben Norton, of course, we all know Ben Norton from a geopolitical economy report. Danny Haifeng, of course, Danny Haifeng has his own incredibly big YouTube channel. He also is a co-founder of Friends of Socialist China. Ting's Chuck, who I've also interviewed, and Chao Collective, who I've had Charles Su on. So I don't know who's going to be from Chao Collective, but it's really an exciting lineup, and I will of course be chairing.
Yeah, so I mean, so you should be home, but really great names. Carlos, I think he's going to be also in that. And I think it's very important to understand that China's success is not a capitalist effort. It's the opposite. And I think this is the most important thing, because if you think China is a capitalist effort, you would think it's also an empire. You think it's also dismantling sovereignties around the world, and you are removing from this equation the most important aspect. And another world is possible, and China is showing this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's so important to realize, like, when we say things like China maxing, et cetera, it's not just because it's Chinese. It's a specific system that they've implemented that have resulted in these achievements. So it's going to be a really important and interesting, what is it called? Webinar. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. But what do we have up today? I'm just going to remove that. We are going to be playing this interview that we have with Eduardo Flores Torres about the Cuba crisis. And then we will be talking about, Zhao will be joining us in the second hour, and he will be talking about meta verdicts. You know, is this a game changer for social media? It's a pretty big verdict, and it's going to be very interesting. So we're going to look at that. And then, of course, you're going to cover and you'll watch the UN Ghana slavery resolution, which is very instructive in many ways. And I'm going to be talking about the Philippines declaration of state of national energy emergency. We're going to look at why they are the first country to declare this. And, you know, spoiler alert, it has something to do with, or everything to do with, U.S. imperialism.
Oh, wow.
Shocking. I'm shocked. And you're shocked?
I'm totally shocked here. I think I'm in the wrong show.
I know. If you're shocked, you're on the wrong show. But yeah, so first we're gonna start with the interview. Oh gosh, wait, sorry about the technical issues that I'm having here. It seems like it did not load. Anyway, I'm gonna Flores Torres, welcome to Global South Rising. Thank you so much for joining us again on Empire. Sorry about that. Okay, let me just read his bio and then we'll go into the interview. Eduardo Flores Torres is a Mexican and cinematographer and co-director of Fidel Up Close, a documentary offering an intimate portrait of Fidel Castro through rare archival footage and testimonies from family, collaborators, and Cuban intellectuals. He is also a graduate of the London Film School and a member of the Mexican Society of Cinematographers and the Society of Camera Operators in Los Angeles. Okay, so that's his bio. And he's just returned from Cuba. He's also doing a new documentary. So we're actually going to be talking about that. So yeah, anything else to add before I play this?
No, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Pitch. So I interviewed you for Global Majority for Peace a few months ago about your award-winning documentary, Fidel Up Close, an intimate portrait of Fidel Castro, a historical biographical project about the commander-in-chief and leader of the Cuban Revolution. You are currently working on a new documentary on the embargo blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba for more than 6 decades. This is the longest unilateral blockade in history, but has seen what many are calling genocidal escalations in the past few months. Now, you recently actually came back from a trip to Cuba. Can you give us a picture of what it is actually like on the ground? And I mean, you've been to Cuba many times before. Obviously, you did the Fidel Up Close documentary there. Can you sort of explain how the conditions are different now under the current escalations?
Well, yeah, Cuba's always been a very unique place to visit because on the first impression, once you get there or people get there for the first time, it strikes them that Cuba, especially Havana, seems to be a place stuck in time. Like somehow the passage of time just got frozen there a few decades ago. But at the same time, Cuba is a country altogether that's far ahead on so many aspects of life than any other country, certainly in Latin America and in the global South, probably also like around the world. It's so ahead in some of the what we call the civic conscious, the people's participation in programs in their community, in education, in level of understanding of various things, of military, also of military readiness. So it is small of a shock, but it takes some time to understand what makes Cuba so unique, so different. And even to me, that I've been there so many times, I still get there and I get surprised of the kind of things one sees that might seem contradictory, especially coming from another Latin American country such as Mexico, which has its other whole bunch of challenges ahead. But they're similar but completely different challenges than the ones to Cuba. They're similar basically because we are very similar. The people are very similar from one country to the other. But the whole scenario in Cuba after this form of government that for over 60 years that's been building up a country and a society around a socialist and communist concept, it brings together a completely different aspect of life on every sense. So since I've been to Cuba for the last 30 years pretty often, basically I've seen many things. Every time I get there seem to be like really deep, really profound changes happening. And there are changes, all within the framework of the socialist state. So, but this time was different in the way that you can see and feel the pain of the people at a different level. I mean, always there have been like heavy complaints because everyday life seemed to be like more difficult than anywhere else because of the shortage of everything in Cuba and the difficulty to have access to what we might regard here in the West as basic woods for everyday life. In Cuba, it doesn't go that way. Sometimes getting the most essential basic thing is like a major battle. That was before. Now is all of that plus an extremely hard fuel shortage that basically affects everything. And there's also the situation that people in the US or in Brazil, in England, anywhere, might turn on the TV and see, the bombing in Iran, the bombing in Israel, the bombing of Gaza, the war in Ukraine. And people might think that, Cuba, the situation in Cuba is easy because the bombs are not falling there yet. But it's very difficult to understand what it means to be out of light, to be on a permanent blackout, where you only get like normal electricity at your house for 2 hours, probably 4 hours a day. That affects everything. Not only your ability to carry on your daily life, but things as simple as the water pump wouldn't come on if there's no electricity, and then you won't be able to flush the toilet. Something as easy as that we obviously give for granted becomes a mission in a place like Cuba now. Now, not having fuel for transportation is not something that a lot of people regard just as a luxury or some leisure thing that doesn't really impact the people. But besides the difficulties of going anywhere, because to go anywhere you need transportation, unless you're just going around the corner, that also affects, apart from private and public transport, it affects the emergency services, affects the food and water distribution, everything. So every aspect of life is on a great impact. And I came back like really shocked after having witnessed that firsthand and seeing the level of obviously of anxiety and fear that creates in people, because behind this daily life situation, there's a rhetoric that the military aggression might come any moment. So people literally think and feel that their lives are on the line, which is not difficult to see why, given what's happening around the world at the same time. So it is a very difficult situation, but I'm confident that these too will pass.
Hopefully. That takes me to the next question. In fact, is how did you, in your last trip, how do you feel people are actually coping with this situation? Are there strategies being adopted to deal with this fuel shortage? I mean, are they resisting? Is it more, desperation? What did you feel, everyday Cubans are doing to cope with the situation?
Well, there's a lot of desperation indeed. Yes, I mean, people just don't know what's coming next, and it's very difficult to deal with your needs of every day. But apart from that, I would say that there are two main situations. In Havana and within the big urban areas, people tend to be more fed up. And what you listen to all the time to the people in the street is that whatever it takes, let's get over this. Let's get this passed. Let's do whatever they were asked for in order to lower the pain of this situation. But then when you go out on the countryside and you go to the smaller towns, you kind of feel that there's a different approach to the situation. The difficulties are there still, but people tend to be more resistant in the way that the comment that you hear more often once you go out of Havana is that doesn't matter, whatever it takes, even if it takes our own lives, we'll resist. And that you listen to all the time out in the big cities. So I would say that because people in the cities are exposed to a whole bunch of other thinking and images and news and all of that, tend to not give up, but to lower the hands before people in the countryside. If you were only to go to the country and you would listen what the vast majority of people tell you, then you would be back being absolutely convinced that doesn't matter how hard the pressure is, Cuba and the revolution will remain.
Yeah. Do you want to go to your next question? I was just going to comment on that. Is that okay?
No,
Go ahead, João.
Yeah, no, I was there a few years ago, 2 years ago, for the Havana Film Festival. I'm also a documentary filmmaker. And I was very impressed, as you said, I had always wanted to go. My father had been many times, had met Fidel and everything. And I was, if there was one thing that really, moved me is, the way I could talk to general people, regardless of them wanting to flee the country or not. I felt the level of basic education was very high. So even on a Coco taxi, we were talking about the current world affairs in a way I could not talk to a Uber driver in Brazil. There's no way, because those are all taken by, controlled by the big techs and that type of mentality. So I was very moved by that. I really had some really interesting conversations. And I could see already then that there were a lot of issues because of the blockade. It's one of the things that I thought was interesting reading about your future documentary is distinguishing the language of blockade versus embargo, right? Which I thought was very, very interesting, and it relates also to what the right wing has done in Brazil, and they call the impeachment of Dilma instead of a coup d'état, right? So, maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that before Ileana jumps into this foreign affair question.
Sure. I mean, that is something definitely worthwhile commenting on, because it's one of the tricks that people are fed on all the time, which has to do with the language. There are many language tricks when you refer to the situation in Cuba. The first one is this one. The Americans like to call it embargo because it entails a legal maneuver to embargo Cuba for their misdeeds, basically. But in reality, it's a blockade because they're actually preventing other countries and other companies from accessing not only the market, but for accessing Cuba as a country and the Cuban government to do all sorts of business, even preventing people to travel. They're preventing them from doing any financial transaction because the financial world is very based on the US dollar and it goes one way or the other goes to the US banking system. So there's where they blockade all of that. So that's not an embargo. And in any case, the embargo was this term that was taken pretty soon after the first big steps of the revolution were taken in the early 60s, which had to do with the confiscation of foreign property when the government started turning into a communist state. There's something very important here to understand. Many Americans like to say that they have embargoed Cuba because they missed on compensating the American owners of the property that was confiscated. And once you dig a little bit into that issue, you find out various things that very little people actually know or like to talk about. First, during that stage of the revolution, a lot of American property was confiscated, but also a lot of Mexican property, English property, Canadian property, Spanish property, because the turnaround of the government from a capitalist state to a communist state required that. Every country was compensated for the property that was confiscated. Everyone. The only one that did not accept compensation was the US. And they did it because they wanted that excuse to be able to exercise pressure on Cuba based on the false idea that they did not compensate the American companies that were confiscated then, which is false. So the embargo comes from there. But then the embargo turned into a blockade because Cuba being an island, the physical feasibility of blockading it is much easier. Let's say Brazil. It'll be very difficult to blockade Brazil because it has like a land frontier, land border with many countries that's thousands of kilometers. Even Mexico, we have our land border with the US, but also with Belize and Guatemala, and we have huge oceans on both sides. Let's say Venezuela. Venezuela has a huge land border too. With Cuba, for its island geographical situation, it has already been physically blocked by the US Navy when the missile crisis in the early 60s. And then it's been on and off on this situation. One example of this is what's been happening in the Caribbean with American warships bombing fishermen boats with the pretext, with no evidence, with the pretext of them carrying drugs into the US. So that makes the situation much harder. Much harder. So then in reality, it is a blockade. The island is blockaded, and now it's much easier. Although they have said that that's not true. They have argued in defense of the embargo for what I said earlier. President Trump and Secretary Rubio have acknowledged that it is a blockade, and they pretend to tighten the blockade as much as they can. I hope I answered the question with this long answer.
Yeah. No, really good, really interesting. And I'm talking more about Marco Rubio. I think there's something quite interesting about someone Cuban as he is, turning around basically. And this happens a lot, I mean, in the world, although I think I think it was his parents or his grandparents were actually, they weren't actually persecuted under communism. That's what I heard. It was more to do with the previous.
His parents left Cuba before the revolution. So they're not Castro exiles, as they call them. They left because what people do in life, they leave and they settled in the US. But then he grew up, Rubio grew up with the exile community that came with the Castro revolution. So he pretends to make himself one of them, when in fact he's never set foot in Cuba himself.
Oh wow, okay. That's so interesting because he the way he presents himself is like he has this crusade against Cuba, essentially. And I think it's quite telling that Trump is pushing, again, on this same subject of using language in the way that the US uses it. Trump is pushing what he's calling a friendly, in quotes, a friendly takeover of Cuba. Yeah, how you could be friendly in your takeover of another country. And
What he means is without too many bombs.
Probably. Yeah, I think that's what it means.
Not too many.
Obliterating the country with all the Tomahawk missiles.
But let me just say something here, Ileana, to make your point. Why would they take over? Why? Why would they take military action? Why? I mean, Cuba is a friendly country. He's got good relations with every country, also with the United States, because given the proximity of the countries, there are many issues on the bilateral agenda they have to deal with anyway all the time. They have to do with sea borders, that have to do with the fight on terrorism, on narcotics. All of that has to do with the ocean, which is at south of the United States and the north of Cuba and all the Caribbean. It's very important that they work coordinated in order to achieve this kind of success story in the Caribbean, which are even acknowledged by the Americans. Their best partner in preventing terrorism and narcotics from South America into the US is Cuba. So Cuba does not represent a threat to the US or to anyone.
Yeah, but I have to caveat that by saying that we do know that the war on drugs is mainly a US CIA operation. Sure. So it's kind of the narco-terrorism pretext of it's really just this US intervention thing. Granted, there are lots of parts of this sort of war on drugs that I think are probably out of control at this point. And so there are competing self-interests within that. But I mean, I think this idea that the US is able to really cooperate with another country in a equitable way is just, I don't think we're in that world anymore, if ever. But yeah, I think that you just saying that that is something that we've been really sort of exploring on Global South Rising, this idea of why is the US acting in the way it is, sort of in a bid to regain an imagined unipolarity. I think a lot of people would argue that the US never really had a true hegemony on the world, but definitely has always been seeing themselves as the number one superpower and wants to sort of continue that.
Well, those days are over. I mean,
well,
the world is over.
Those days are definitely over, and they may not. I think they were artificially inflated in the beginning, because of the emergence out of World War II anyway. But it's definitely over because of the rise of China. And so China becomes, again, enemy number one. And somehow Cuba as well, because why is Cuba, like you're saying, a small island really in a strategic position, but really in the grand scheme of things, the geopolitical landscape, Cuba can just be left alone and it would not be a threat to anybody.
No,
so I mean,
there's a very easy answer to that. The Cuban exile community, mainly resident in the south of Florida, exercise huge pressure on the government, mainly because they do represent a major voting power. So the elections, the voting that they represent in any election is very important. So they kind of nature on this community in order to have their votes. Basically, if they weren't there, if the Cubans from Cuba would have established themselves in the Dominican Republic or in Puerto Rico, most likely a lot of this wouldn't be happening. The fact that they're established in the US, that they exercise such big influence there in politics and in economics also in the south of Florida explains this, number one. And number two, the US has actually had pretenses over Cuba for many years. I mean, even before the first independence, that wasn't like a true independence, it's when Cuba changed hands from the Spaniards into the Americans at the beginning of last century, at the beginning of the 19th century, at the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. They wanted to purchase Cuba a few times, and that's very well documented. And then once they granted independence to Cuba at the early 20th century, they also wanted to purchase the island again. And there are many declarations of high-end politicians in the U.S. throughout history that have expressed their willingness to incorporate Cuba into the Union, mainly because it's strategic location. It'll be the southernmost part of the U.S. It's a beautiful, real estate, and they haven't managed to do that. Then, with the advent of the Castro-led revolution, this became an obsession. Not only because they wanted to actually acquire, for good or for bad, they wanted to acquire the land. They couldn't cope with a government that's as defiant as it is, and as defiant as it's been since Castro arrived in power 67 years ago. So there's a long history there. But the pretenses of the U.S. on Cuba are old.
Yeah, it's interesting what you brought up, and I think one.
Hi, sorry about this really bad technical difficulty I'm having for some reason. Sarah, can I bring you on to react?
Yeah.
I get you back on. Sorry about that. So I think so far, what do you think? I think like one of the things that before I get your reaction, I was just like thinking about, again, like exploring this idea of like why the US is acting in the way it's acting. There's always like these little things that little details that country has, and all these different constituents, etc. But I'm like a broken record, but essentially it just comes back to this like US hegemony sort of scenario, which, like we've discussed with Matthew Hove, is just an inability to accept that that's no longer possible in this new multilateral world.
Yeah, I think there is a very important question there is why Cuba? And I have to say I strongly disagree with Eduardo. Why Cuba? Because if you look at today, you would see an island suffocated by sanctions. Then you can say, well, Cuba is not a threat. No, Cuba is an immense threat, an unmatched threat in many aspects for the imperial world. And this has not to do with the Cuba we know today, suffering under sanction, but this has to do with the foundational aspects of the Cuban Revolution. I think the Cuban role in supporting anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles is one of the most distinctive characteristics of its foreign policy and of the Cuban Revolution itself. It was framed on the internationalism, solidarity, and not in this very conventional sense of diplomacy, something completely new, and Fidel Castro, and he was bold, he openly challenged the US, Cuba openly defined themselves as anti-imperialist, in a era which you don't do this. He openly defined it as anti-colonial, and not only defined but exported a revolution. Cuba, military interventions, training intelligence, medical, education assistance. Look what Cuba did in Africa. Cuba deployed, I think, almost 50,000 troops against the apartheid in South Africa.
And let me just add here, Sarah, because to give the context of Eduardo's film about Fidel Up Close, really does show this. He shows the revolutionary figure of Fidel. Like, he shows just how important Fidel was. Like, it's I'm very much against the cult of personality, but we cannot actually argue against the fact that this was an extremely, not only charismatic, he was extremely charismatic, but resolutely anti-imperialist leader.
Exactly.
Now, the type of thought leader and the type of leader that we solely need in this moment. So I totally agree with you, Sarah. I think that is, and in a sense, with Eduardo, a shame that we can't all be live at the same time. The time difference is very difficult. But, you know, I feel like sometimes what happens is because we as anti-imperialists, we're in a world where we're constantly having to explain things to people that don't even understand imperialism, say, that sometimes we might like change some of our words or the way that we explain things, you know, like that's I wonder if that's a thing here with Eduardo, sort of trying to explain all the different details within, you know, how Cuba is feeling and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think Cuba has a legacy of playing a genuine role in anti-colonial struggles, in particular in Africa. Cuba for Latin America is the dream, is the utopia that there is a possibility of a Latin American without US intervention in real terms, you know. If maybe the Soviet Union was more strategic in who they would help, Cuba was solely ideological in the good sense. You know, there's an ideological commitment and very unusual. And this, you know, Ileana, it's a small state exporting a solid revolutionary experience and supporting anti-colonial experience. Cuba is huge. Cuba has.
I will say though that one of the things with the documentary, and I interviewed Eduardo on Global Majority for Peace, so please like check that out, audience, for whoever is more interested in this subject. He showed like a really interesting relationship between Che Guevara, of course, and Fidel Castro, and how sometimes it would diverge in terms of the ability to export revolution. You know what I mean? So that is kind of an interesting discussion in terms of revolutionary anti-imperialist forces. And so they did diverge at a certain extent, where Che committed himself more to the type of revolutionary support that you're talking about in Africa, etc. So I think that is an important distinction to make, but, you know, maybe not so important in this moment in time when we are analyzing the significance of Cuba and why the Trump administration, or really the US just in general, but the Trump administration has definitely ramped this up to an absolutely insane level, on why they want to crush Cuba so much, you know?
Cuba is the cemetery of American imperialist hegemonic in Latin America, their backyard, what they call the backyard. It's the place where they failed, consistently failed, still are failing, you know, and it's so inspirational. Like when we see now Iran rising and give you the turn for the global South, showing that you can actually win from the biggest, largest, consistently military hegemon. It sends a very important message to all anti-colonial movements. See Palestine. Palestine is a crushed place in all senses, but it sends such an important message because, you know, Ileana, we are human beings. We don't only live from water and things. We live from dreams. We live from imagination. We live from inspiration. And this is we can't dissociate ourselves from that. And to have an example, historical examples of small places being so successful against the giant, it's really, it means a lot. And Cuba, I think Cuba, if you talk like to my parents' generation, Cuba changed their lives. Cuba changed a lot of things. Even the countries who hasn't been through a revolutionary experience, hasn't been through a socialist experience, Cuba made a difference in different levels, but it always did. So I think Cuba, it's fundamental to crush Cuba to win as a ideological hegemon. It's fundamentally important. And I think Carlos commented also in one of our shows that the attack on Venezuela is a way of attacking Cuba by proxy as well. And I think it's correct. I think it's a correct analysis. Yeah, long live Cuba. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll continue with this. And see
Okay.
One of the things that, you know, in the film I did with Chomsky and Celso Amorim, we talked about how the U.S. always viewed Latin America as its backyard. right? So I think it's I mean, there's definitely the fact of this, elite that moved from Cuba to the U.S. that, actually acts as a local pressure, right? So it's, as you said, Florida, and because of the electoral college system, I think, the Cuban Americans of Florida have a big play on, where the elections are going to go. And I end up having an effect on the whole country, the result of a presidential election. Right, so I think that's
we saw with Bush.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
but again, it's that same mentality we've talked about a lot with Israel and stuff like that, where it's basically like the U.S. creates these diasporas. They do that with China as well. There's always very youthful parts of the diaspora with Iranians as well, that they want to trot out to justify why they're allowed to invade, or they have to invade for moral reasons. And then, of course, that it becomes sort of like a lobbyist system, because their entire system is a lobbyist system. So, but it's really, at the end of the day, it is their mechanism that is giving these groups power or prominence or a spotlight. Once this political reason for invading Cuba, and we have to talk about the capitalist communist situation with the Cold War, essentially. If the Cold War ceases to exist, the power of these lobbyists would go as well. Like, that's what happened in many cases, in different parts of the world, right? So I think, again, I'm just going to blame the US. But continue.
Yeah, I think it's, yes, you can blame the US, but certainly. But I think, specifically on top of this, finishing what I was just bringing up, on top of this kind of local politics, right, appealing to the Cuban and Latin community in the U.S., there's also an ideological reasoning behind this. Cuba is the longest lasting socialist regime, is the only one really today in Latin America, and it has always inspired many movements across the continent. I think both in Mexico, here in Brazil, certainly, and having that so close to the U.S., I don't think is something that they were ever, I'd like to hear Eduardo on that, but I think that's something that they were never able to fully digest. And especially when Cuba is able to have, such an incredible educational system, such an incredible medical system in Brazil. We benefited from Cuban doctors when we had a shortage a few years ago. It was extremely criticized by the right, so they're able to ideologically, for Latin Americans, they represent somehow hope. And I don't think that's acceptable by the Americans.
No, of course not. I mean, they will never tolerate the example of something done well in a different way, so close to them. And that's the core of the issue. President Trump and others like to talk about Cuba as a failed state. And I wonder, what do they mean with failed state? Because if we research what failed state means, it is basically the lack of institutions, the lack of a structure from the government reaching to the people. That's basically a failed state. When the regime in Syria collapsed and it dropped into chaos, the same as in Iraq, after both foreign interventions, that becomes a failed state, because the institutions that are there set to coordinate everything that happens at the population level cease to operate. Now, in Cuba, that has one of the highest literacy rates in the whole of Latin America, that has one of the lowest infant mortality rates in the whole of Latin America, even above the US, that has achievements in medicine and so many other fields higher than any other country, that have excelled also in sport, like any other country, being such a small country that's been number one in so many sports for so many years, culture, science, diplomacy. So I don't see a failed state there, but all the contrary is the state that has made all these achievements a reality. Now, another two of the big issues that the U.S. throws on Cuba are the political prisoners and the fact of the unit party system. let's talk about the political prisoners. I mean, it is a strong state, and there's surely some prisoners that are there for having, expressed different way of thinking and different way of acting. With all of the people that are in prison in Cuba, they are in prison because of some crime well established under the law, and being financed by a foreign state and then doing propaganda about the current government. It goes against the law, both in Cuba and in the United States. In fact, the US is the country in the world that has the highest per capita prison rate. The more prisoners in the world per capita is in the US. And many of them are actually political prisoners. We can see at the latest examples of all these basically kids that got arrested because they manifested pro-Palestine in some US campuses. And they were put into prison because of that. That's political prosecution. That's political prisoners because they were put into custody because of their thing. Even having said that, the rate of prisoners in Cuba is so much lower than the rate of prisoners in the US. That's a bit hypocritical to claim that. And then from the US, they also say a lot about the one-party system. And I asked myself, well, in the US, it's a two-party system, which is pretty close. The US is not a system where every party is allowed to operate. You cannot go and form a socialist party, a communist party, a trotskist party, any kind of party, an anarchist party. You cannot do any of that. There are only two parties that are very alike. And if you want to play in politics, you have to go there. It would make sense that if they ask Cuba for a multi-party system, then the US would also open to a multi-party system, wouldn't it? That would make sense. Otherwise, it's just hypocrisy. How can those issues be thrown onto the Cubans as a obligation for the US to release the pressure on Cuba? It just doesn't make sense.
I think the thing that's really convenient about US narratives against countries, any country that's on the enemy state, the US actually just uses the exact same playbook, because these charges of what they use against China, what they use against North Korea, what they use against Iran, it's the same thing. I mean, who's to say there's something inherently unstable anyway from our current system, which is like in the UK, it's like 5-year term. In the US, it's a 4-year term. I mean, in terms of because of the midterms, in terms of like the actual ability to have a proper plan, it makes more sense to have the China system, which has like 5-year plans, but then it also has a 30-year plan and also has like a 50-year plan. You know what I mean? Like rather than like 2-year plans and not even plans that are implemented. So yeah, there's so much US propaganda, which I guess leads us to how are the people really reacting to, and like you said, these claims by Marco Rubio saying like the Cuban economy doesn't work, etc. You sort of inferred previously that maybe the cities, the sentiment in the cities are different from the countryside.
Definitely, yeah.
So when they hear this type of very, very escalatory rhetoric from Marco Rubio, basically saying like, the economy doesn't work, the political and government system can't fix it, so they have to change dramatically. It's really a huge threat. How are they? What is the reaction to that on the ground?
I mean, there is a lot of fear, because people know that this can turn into military action pretty easily. So there's a lot of fear, but there's also a lot of exhaustion. If you think about it, the embargo was first put in place by President Kennedy in 1962. So my generation, our generation in Cuba, were born with the blockade already, and their children were born with the blockade. So these are people that have lived blockaded or under the blockade for all of their lives, and that is like really, really like difficult to imagine that every single day. So the U.S. claims that the Cuban economy doesn't work. How can an economy work with such a pressure from the outside when you're not allowed to even buy an aspirin because the reach of the blockade is so big that it prevents any company from any country in the world to do so. Okay, I mean, they might claim that no, companies are not prevented to, but they're punished. If companies that trade with the U.S. also trade with Cuba, then they're punished by not trading with the U.S. If boats dock at a Cuban port, then they're forbidden from docking at a U.S. port. So they might not be prevented firsthand, but the other actions that they do, they prevent other countries from exchanging with Cuba anyway. So accessing anything becomes so difficult, so difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. I mean, recently the Brazilian government officials were questioned why they weren't, helping Cuba more. And, what was said was exactly that the mechanism the U.S. put in place make it almost impossible to actually help. But recently, we talked about that last week, the MST, I don't know if you know, the Movimento dos Trabalhadores Sem Terra, which is the movement of the laborers without land here in Brazil. They actually bypassed all governments, bought directly 2 tons of medicine to send to Cuba and send them directly, right? So that brings me a little bit to my next question, because given the mainstream media often repeating the same stories and creating this whole scenario around Cuba, what do you think people can do right now to support the Cuban people? What are the things that can be done? I mean, one example was the MST, but what else do you think can be done? How can people help, since this blockade is so strong?
Well, definitely by contacting and joining your local solidarity group, or join your solidarity campaign wherever you are. Around the world, there are more than 1,800 registered Cuba solidarity groups. So there's always one within reach. The one in the UK is very strong. The Cuba Solidarity Campaign is called. I'm sure there's one in Brazil. In Mexico, there are quite a few, but there are 2 main ones. And what we're doing here is that we're calling for action in the media, in social, in the newspaper, and people are doing donations. And then we gather all of that, and it's sent either by boat or by plane. There's still regular airplane flights between Mexico and Havana now, but the Mexican government has sent so far, I believe, 4 major Navy boats to carry goods and to carry donations from Mexico to Cuba, and that's still gonna continue happening. Now the other flotilla, the one that left from Yucatan and arrived in Cuba, I believe 2 days ago. In fact, Gregory Colvin was there. That carried a lot of goods that were put together in the port from all over Latin America, and then sailed over to Cuba. So there are many ways, but I would suggest through your local solidarity group, try to be part of it, try to join in the effort.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we have had on the UK National Director, I think, of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign on here. We'll be having on a few more who are actually going to be going to Cuba and bringing some aid. So, for audience who's watching, we'll definitely be adding in links and things that you can actually do. But
what is needed now is petroleum. That's what's needed. And there's also been a lot of criticism here that even with the threats from the U.S. government, Mexico stopped sending petroleum to Cuba, so is Brazil. And a lot of the people here claim that even the tariffs threat is a small price to pay in order to show how much we care for the situation in Cuba. But then I also understand that our president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is under tremendous pressure from some, important economical groups here in Mexico that don't want to upset at all the very delicate relationship with the United States. So I'm sure it's a very similar situation in Brazil.
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of economic pressure. We suffered from tariffs last year, and also we're in an electoral year this year. So, and the situation is not necessarily extremely favorable to Lula. He's at a tie with Bolsonaro's son, and the middle class, unfortunately, in Brazil tends to be more right wing. So he needs to be cautious about anything he does with Cuba or China or that, not to lose the elections completely. So it's very complicated, right? But having said that, there has been in the UN, like for years, 180 countries have always condemned the embargo, and so I think there's an internet, and even in the CELAC meeting, there was a common communication condemning the decades-long economic blockade. I think to a certain extent, Russia and China have also condemned, but then condemning is not enough right now, I think, right? So I don't know. What do you think is okay? We talked about what people can do, a little bit about states and about this economic pressure from groups. But do you think there is maybe a role that Russia and China can play, maybe a stronger role in, at least, they're not going to end the blockade, but at least softening the effects of it a little bit?
Well, we all thought that both Russia, but especially China, would have played a more active role in this whole fuel shortage situation. Now, it is a very complex geopolitical situation now with the war in Iran, because the war in Iran affects directly China, because Iran is the main oil supplier to China, and China needs tons of oil. China feeds from Iranian oil and from Russian gas. But cutting off a big part of the Iranian oil, that's the main result that the U.S. government wants, because the real enemy here is China. Of course.
I just want to say, though, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I want to say that I think it's a little bit the other way around. China is the biggest importer of Iranian oil.
Yeah, that's what I said.
But Iranian oil only accounts for, I think, about 13% of China's imports of oil. So while I agree with you that China is U.S.'s target, and obviously they're going to be very cautious and very protective of their people. I don't know. I also struggle to understand why they can't help Cuba more, because they're not in as dire straits as it would suggest if they were getting the majority of their oil from Iran, for example. You know what I mean? So I know that they gave I think 90,000 tons of rice, and they gave some aid. But in terms of oil, considering that their ships can pass through the Strait of Hormuz, I'm struggling. But go ahead.
No, it's difficult to understand. There are many things at play, and there's also a lot of things that we don't know.
Exactly, yes.
And the geopolitical balance is very delicate, especially because it's very difficult to anticipate what's going to happen, because the decisions that are taken on the American side are completely out of the blue. One day is one thing and the other day is the other thing. There doesn't seem to be a institutionalized decision-taking process. It seems that some people wake up in the morning with one feeling, and then the other day with another one, and then things are pushed one way one day and pushed the other way another day, without any consistency. So I think Russia is entangled already with the Ukrainian situation, which is, I believe, completely playing in his favor, because basically the Western world has started to realize that Ukraine and the NATO expansion pretenses draw them into a war that's unwinnable, because from the Ukrainian side, it's an unwinnable battle. And the major Western powers are not going to put boots on the ground. So this war is dragging along on the Ukrainian expense, basically. And I think Russia has a very clear objective there, and it's also very cautious on how far they can reach as to come to Cuba's aid. Right. China is different. China is I think, in a much stronger situation, and they could, because on the other hand, there is the Taiwan situation at the same time playing there. It's always an element, and the war in Iran is very close to them. I also thought that the BRICS powers were gonna react like with more force when the Israeli and U.S. invasion started. But it seems that they, apart from some logistical assistance to Iran, which is a BRICS member, the assistance stopped there. So that's also something a little bit difficult to understand. Basically, it all plays little by. It's like a big chessboard, you know.
Yeah, and also there is also just the reality of, if every disaster that the U.S. makes, China is supposed to, you know, we're all looking at China to save everybody, and I don't think that's really realistic for China as well. You know, I mean, they have a huge population that, even though they have gotten rid of absolute poverty, they're still quite a poor, there's still a huge majority that is, no majority, a huge percentage that is still quite poor. So it's not so simple as that, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't think it's a financial. I don't think that has to do with it at all. I think it has, you know, I think, you know, financially it certainly could do. I mean, China does have a politics of investment that, you know, expects returns, right? 40% returns on investment. And that's certainly something that's not going to happen in Cuba. But I think furthermore, in my opinion, I'd like to hear Eduardo, I think, you know, Russia is very committed to the war in Ukraine, and that limits its resources in the Caribbean, and also, you know, hinders, I mean, the fact, if they start to intervene too much in what the U.S. is doing, the U.S. was intervene more in what they're doing in Ukraine. So I think that's one reason. I think the other reason has to do with, you know, the geographical difficulties. You know, Venezuela was able to send subsidized oil for many years to Cuba. It was right there, right? You know, China and Russia are, you know,
on the other end,
very, very far away. And now, as you put very well, Eduardo, you know, having to deal with, you know, more expensive fuel, which makes it even more harder. So, you know, this whole war in Iran makes it even harder to maybe provide fuel to Cuba. And I think in the case of China, you know, they don't want to have a direct, in my view, my opinion, right? They don't want to have like a direct conflict like that with the U.S. I mean, there was already the issues with tariffs. So I think, although, you know, Russia and China and Brazil as well has in the UN repeatedly voted, you know, against the blockade, they're limited geographically in what they can do, and also because the U.S. has, you know, been intercepting boats in Venezuela. They're not the same. So I think there's some of that. And I think, you know, China, you know, maybe, and, you know, maybe Ileana is not going to like this, but China is also maybe using this moment because it has its own interests in Taiwan, right? And if they start to interfere on the other side of the globe and what the U.S. is doing, they might feel that they're, you know, this might cause some tension there. So I'd like to hear what you both think of that.
I think definitely everything is linked. Everything is linked, and everything plays a part. Absolutely. Sorry, Lana. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, you go ahead first.
Yes, I think all of that plays a role. There's also the geographical difficulty, both from Russia and for China, to reach a hand to Cuba, which is on the other side of the world, and you can only access it from the east, because from the west you would have to go through the Panama Canal, and the Panama Canal now is in trouble also because they taken away some Chinese concessions there to operate the canal. So going from the west, from China to Cuba, most likely would have to go around the south of South America, which is makes it unfeasible. So it's very difficult there to wedge. I think what they are banking on is on most of the attention being shifted to the Middle East, which is letting Trump's popularity continue to fall and wait for the midterm elections in November. And that will do a huge change in the whole political scenario, especially because if Trump loses majority in the House, not only a lot of these policies will be more difficult to implement, but also there's a threat of an impeachment for him for many other sins in the past. But this coming election is very important, and Trump's popularity keeps on falling down. So I think all of that plays in the wild card of gaining time. And I think the Cuban people are prepared to resist until November, and then try to recuperate from this situation.
I was going to say, unfortunately for the Cuban people, this strategic timing could be devastating, right? Because they need fuel and food right away. But I guess that's how global politics work. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to find ways, since the states are not acting, to show solidarity to Cuba in other ways, right?
Absolutely. It's very difficult, but it's also like really sad. Like you go there and people ask, and you ask yourself, why make this collective punishment happen? And as a matter of fact, collective punishment, which is what that is a heavy crime under international law, and collective punishment is completely banned from Geneva Convention, and it's one of the main crimes that are trying to be omitted. Like, we have good memories from corrupt collective punishment. Probably one of the worst is what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Second World War. Then what happened in the Balkans during the war in the early 90s. Actually what's happening in Gaza. All of those are examples of collective punishment, which are all wrongful under international law. But then the aggressor doesn't seem to care very much about the law and about anything.
Even calling it collective punishment is kind of it's unfair in a way, because it's not a punishment for something done. You know what I mean?
That's exactly what it is. I mean, the reason why is punishable under international law is because it's not fair to punish the people as a collective group.
But I mean, there's no reason. There's no they did nothing to be punished.
Exactly.
Yeah, is what I'm saying. So I think it's just
the U.S. view, they took the land that belonged to American farmers in the revolution, as Eduardo put, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. has changed. The U.S. has changed their rhetoric many times. At a moment said the embargo was because of that. Then they changed their mind and said, no, the embargo is because Cuba's alignment to the Soviet Union. Then they changed again and said, no, the embargo is because Cuba's assistance to the independence movements throughout the world.
Then human rights,
whatever.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing, is that
in the meantime we have Guantanamo.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God.
Guantanamo, yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, right? U.S. imperialism will always come up with some sort of reason, and at the end of the day, it's just because of imperialism, i.e., capital gain and etc. But I mean, I think just to sort of wrap up on the China thing, I think one thing that people tend to sort of maybe not consider with China is that they are really very cautious. I think in terms of, they don't underestimate how powerful the U.S. empire is. You know what I mean? They do see the danger of the U.S. And I think a lot of the time, because we're seeing the decline of the U.S. and the decline of U.S. imperialism, I think a lot of people think sort of underestimate how dangerous the U.S. really is, even as it's declining. And China is just really cautious in that sense. So But I do hope, like you're saying, that there will be some aid coming in the next few months, because that at least is a possibility, right? Like the solar panels, there were like 50 solar parks, I think, that were built in Cuba at the end of last year by China, like and so I was hoping that would continue so that the electrical grid would be at least mainly renewables, and then they wouldn't be so dependent on energy, oil.
Yeah.
But that's obviously going to be slightly disrupted due to what's happening now. But hopefully those things can sort of come back.
I know, of course. Yeah, but that's a transition that takes a while, and it also takes a lot of investment. It's not something that's going to happen now. The pressure on Cuba, the sudden pressure on Cuba, is basically a result of the pressure being put on the president to secure the Southern Florida votes. Basically, it is clear that President Trump didn't have a very clear position on the whole Cuban topic before becoming president. He wasn't there on the topic. That's a new thing. And we've seen that he's very easily influenceable. And Rubio and the people around Rubio, which are these mad anti-Cubans, have been feeding Trump with these ideas. That's not that he came up with or he analyzed it. He just copies ideas and thinking from here and there, and now he's become this anti-Cuban liberator that he's not, but he tries to portray himself like that. But he's also realizing that people already knows that he lies every time he speaks. There's no single time that you can hear that head of state talk the truth, and people already know that. So that's helping bring his popularity lower and lower every day.
Yeah. Eduardo, I have one last question, and then I'm going to have to step out, but it has to do with your work as a documentary filmmaker. I'm a filmmaker myself, and I'd like to ask you, how do you feel that documentary films and, non-aligned media such as Empire Watch can help people around the world, see things differently than what the status quo or the mainstream media wants to show us? And what are your expectations with your film? And I've seen that you're also using fundraising strategy, using what we're calling active non-alignment. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
I think basically going around the information blockade, which we are all subject to, is a main mission. I mean, it's a major enterprise because it's so difficult. Like, you turn the TV and all you get is the regular corporate media everywhere, and you get fed on those news every day, all day, and then your friends and your family and everyone's on that same track. And going around that and trying to access different type of information, different type of news is very difficult. It takes a lot of time. It's not just like turning the TV. Like, if I turn on my TV, well, most likely CNN will come up, which is the same thing. So for quite a while now, I engaged myself in trying to contribute, going around the information embargo. And that's why I love this program so much, Ileana, and I thank you so much for doing it and making it happen, and of course for having me in, because this is a very, not only vital, it's a very necessary voice to hear, and to get to know people like you, João, and to get all your other guests, and hear people speaking in a different language, speaking up to power, basically. And the documentaries I make and the documentaries you make, João, also contribute in this effort. So it's a big, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to get to people to listen to different type of things. The very initial seed on my Fidel documentary was that. I said, I want to tell the people, I want the people to know so many other things about Fidel that nobody seemed to know, and that I know only on the scratch. But with that motivation, I started digging in and bringing to the surface many aspects of Fidel life that nobody seemed to knew. And there is the documentary regardless of whether you like it or not, or whether you're with Fidel or not, it brings to the table a lot of new information that wasn't there. So it helps reinvigorate the debate with more and better information.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Do you have any last words, Joe?
No, I think that was great. I think that was a great way to wrap up, Eduardo.
Thank you guys for watching that. Okay, so João will be joining us soon. What did you think? I had a disagreement with João, so I'm going to ask him about it when he comes on, about the 40% return on investment for China. But yeah, we'll ask João where he got that statistic from when he comes back. But overall, what did you think of the interview, Sara?
Yeah, I'm actually very curious to watch the movie.
Yeah, it's a really good movie.
Yeah, I don't know if the movie is available, whether people can freely watch, but it's also very important to remember history.
It's not available online just yet, but we've put the trailer down in the description, and also the link for Eduardo's new movie, how you can help him fundraise and stuff like that for the documentary on the Cuba blockade. João is in the studio, but we can't see you, just so you know, João. Yeah, so, there you are. Okay, hi, João. Welcome.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Good afternoon for us.
Yes, good afternoon in Europe.
We were just talking about the interview that we did yesterday, and I was saying to Sara that we have a point of disagreement because your 40% return on investment for China, like, I couldn't find where you got that statistic from, and I think there's so many examples where that's just not the case. Like, with Venezuela, with Sri Lanka, where China's restructured their loans and actually lost billions of dollars. So I was curious about where you got that.
Well, I mean, I think the main point there, not to be specific about numbers, is that I think in general, maybe a lot of people in the global South expected Russia and China to act as our protector, and we see that this is not going to happen. And I think there's many reasons around that. One of them might be investment and might be, the return on investment. But certainly there, let's say if China decided to get involved in what's happening in Iran, it's a third world war, right? So I think there's other, I think that's why the US is able to do what it does, because the other countries, they're not so bellic. They don't want to engage in violent acts in the same way, and you're absolutely right. The way China partners with countries around the world and the Silk Belt Initiative and BRICS is a lot more collaborative and has to do with multilateralism. But I think there's only so far that they're willing to go. And it's tricky because, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union played a role in somehow balancing that, that the power of the United States out. And I do think that economically, and even as military capacity, maybe China does, but it doesn't have the will of taking, military action just yet, right?
I mean, you would say that
for the best, because as I said, maybe that would entail in a third world war, and nobody wants that. But at the same time, because nobody's doing anything, the United States and Trump specifically feels comfortable to go and, okay, let's take Maduro out, and now it's Cuba and Iran.
Yeah, but I think we have to also position this in terms of strategy. It is very much like, I think a lot of people might argue that China saw the fall of the Soviet Union and took some lessons from that as well, right? And in terms of their strategy, like we've discussed a lot on this show, they're not imperialist. Their military is not designed as an offensive military. It's a defensive one. They don't have the military installation or infrastructure that a U.S. imperialist system has, because they're not imperialist. So their only weapons would be not to engage in imperialist way, but in a multilateral way. But I guess the conversation that we're having in this particular case is like, why can't they also send oil? Or and you did answer that quite well. You said, like, logistically it's very difficult to move the ships through all these different ways, and but we can hope, like with the 90,000 tons, I think, of rice that's being sent, and I think just arrived in Cuba, and then I think there's a further $80 billion that has also been 80 million, not 80 billion, $80 million that has been promised. I think that there is aid, going to Cuba, and I'm sure there are talks for more. I mean, I can't imagine that they wouldn't be.
And there's those volcanoes, like trying to transition Cuba's energy, which probably is the cleverest thing to do, right? And of course, oil is the most immediate good to make things work, but to think a long term, I think Chinese think very long term. I don't think they experience the world like we do in a very immediate terms. I'd say I think this is a fundamental difference in their philosophy, in their history. Everything is very long term. They are here to stay. They've been here before, with or without the US. And I think, I think they are more of the long runners.
I think Zhao has also worked with them directly, and they're also extremely fast acting, efficient. So I think that's the thing that's sometimes difficult, right, to reconcile, that they can be so quick on one hand. Well,
yeah. Look, I didn't want to sound. I think I didn't want to sound like China is not willing to help. They are. As you said, they sent 60,000 tons of rice earlier this year. They've helped Cuba, I think, with a financial assistance, if I'm not wrong, of around 80 million emergency aid package. Also essential supplies like the solar lamps, roofing materials, so there's stuff that was done for sure. And I think there is something that is real, though, is that Chinese companies, they also they also trade with the U.S. financial system, right? And the U.S., regardless of Trump, is still one of the largest economic partners of China, if not the largest. So there's things are not that simple. Like, it's not like, okay, I hate Trump, let's do this. So I think there's a lot of Chinese companies and even banks, they are at risk of being cut by the U.S. financial system as well. So it's not, my father talked about that as well. It's like they would like to help, Brazilian government would like to help Cuba more, but it's so the embargo or the blockade, as our friend Eduardo put very well, is really, really strong, So it's complicated, and I think there is something to what Sara said, where, maybe the Chinese think in a longer term, more strategically, and but unfortunately for the people that are on the ground in Cuba right now, it's disastrous. It's the same thing as like the Palestinians, or right, people need help now, right? And the time of nations and of world building is not the same as people's individuals needs, I think, right?
Yeah, certainly. Later on in the show, I'll be talking about how the Philippines has just declared the first country to declare national energy emergency, and it kind of, you know, obviously all the things we talk about are linked. They kind of is relevant to this conversation because there are certain things within a country that can be done in order to protect your sovereignty in some way. In terms of Cuba, I mean, we have to think like, obviously they have survived over 60 years of incredible blockade. So the fact that they're have survived that, and they're, you know, in dire straits now is a testament to their strength versus in the Philippines. I mean, we'll get into it. A lot of it is in their own making, you know, rather than but it's difficult. There are contradictions, like you said. There's huge pressure, immense strangulation, and then there's still movement to move. You know, there's still areas where you can move within the cage of imperialism. So we'll be discussing that more. But should we start with your watch, João? Because that like does sort of put us into a different place where, again, a lot of contradictions here. We're talking about the meta verdict that just happened in the U.S. Like one of the cases, I think it's in New Mexico. Correct me if I'm wrong. One of the cases where Meta and YouTube actually lost the case and have been ordered to pay millions of dollars. But you'll get into that. It's a very interesting case because there are thousands of these cases currently active in the U.S. So I don't know what this means, but please tell us.
Yeah, no, I was very glad that you guys brought that up. You know, I have teen kids myself, so I live some of that drama at home. And I called my watch. Yeah, because it's a worldwide.
Tell us about the drama. Get into the personal details.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, when you have the personal part, it's I think easier to see how strong this machine is. So I called my watch. I gave it a name. Our Children's Internet. Who's responsible, right? So as you brought up this week, there were two cases, one in California and one in New Mexico. But this week, a California jury did something that never happened before. On March 25th, Los Angeles courts found Meta and Google liable on all charges for building platforms that harm the young woman's mental health. And according to both NPR and CBS News, the jury ordered the company to pay $6 million in damages, $3 million in compensatory, $3 million in punitive. So Meta will be bearing with 70% of that responsibility. So this is a breakthrough, you know, and this documents, as Kaylee shown, is now this girl is now a 20-year-old. She started using Instagram at the age of 9 and YouTube at the age of 6. By the time she was a teenager, she was suffering from depression, body dysmorphia, suicidal thoughts. NPR basically called this the first time a jury has found the social media apps should be treated as defective products. You know, so this is a big deal. I think it's a big deal. Is there something you wanted to show there, or is that the BBC article?
Yeah, I'm just showing the article that is showing what you're talking about. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the same week in New Mexico, a jury ordered a pay of $375 million for child exploitation violations. It's the first state ever to win such a case against a major tech company. So I think it's a big deal. And, you know, both companies say they will appeal, of course. But meanwhile, according to NPR, roughly 2,000 other pending lawsuits are tied to this case.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like 6 million is nothing. It's almost a nominal value, but it's the open gate for a lot of suits.
Exactly.
especially in a country where case law defines the legal interpretation. So if you take just this case as one single event, probably not too much in terms financial, but if you take it as a whole, it inaugurates a precedent, which is very important. I don't know, Ileana, but I did not grow up in the times of social media. So the max we had was Orkut. And that was already pretty damning for a woman in development, the beauty standards, the body standards. This can be very disturbing for a growing person, for sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm just curious to listen to the rest of your watch because I have questions.
Yeah. So I mean, there's been some responses right now as we see this happening. Last week in Brazil, we had the new ECA Digital approved, which is it's a law that it's the digital law for children and teens. And this law has been updated for teenagers on the digital age. So basically, it updates the protections first established decades ago when we didn't have any social media, so that these protections can be applied online, because it was basically a no man's land. So I think this is very important, and since I got this task of diving into this, I just started researching what's happening in the different countries as well. But so here in Brazil, starting of last week, we have real age verification for social media, because this is something that all the kids are just lying their age to get access to pornography, get access to social media, which is terrible. So there's going to be biometrics or documents, no more self-declaration. Ban on manipulative design for minors, for instance, the infinite scroll. I mean, I could say my daughter, she knows she's addicted now, so we're just working on it. But it's a real problem, and I see it with her friends, and it doesn't matter if you're left wing or right wing, or if you're in China or in the US, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because it's a worldwide, it's almost a pandemic. It's a real problem, and we have to face it, or it might destroy us. It was certainly destroying our youth. So now parental control tools that are easy to use will be active in Instagram and TikTok and this other media. There's a prohibition on commercial exploitation of children images online, that's another thing that was happening, and it's insane, where parents are basically using their kids to make money online. And we in Brazil, we have a term called sharenting, which is terrible, right? It's like you share every moment of your parenting. So now to be able to do anything with kids, and you're going to have a judge approve it. And the ANPD, which is the Brazil Data Protection Authority, now acts as a regulatory agency with the power to fine up to 2% of a company's annual revenue for non-compliance. So we'll see how much this will really help, but I think it's a step in the right direction. It's also something that is happening on other things. Recently we had a worldwide crisis with Roblox. Roblox is a video game that is extremely popular with teenage kids, but also with younger kids. Kids as young as 7-year-olds play Roblox worldwide. And essentially, it's been called by ICL Notícias in Brazil the playground of crime. Kids as early as 13 years old have inside of these platforms being brought into the PCC. So that is the PCC and Comando Vermelho are the agencies Trump called terrorists. They're big drug cartels in Brazil. They've been using this platform to engage kids in their commands. Also, a lot of adults have been approaching children, acting as if they're children to approach and approach kids, and ask them for things. Kids start to have a relationship with somebody online without knowing who they are and what they are up to. So this is something that is being discussed, and recently new regulations were imposed on Roblox. There was a huge protest of kids, and they got angry at this. There's this Felca. He's in Brazil. He's a very popular influencer that talks about the digital world, and he's the guy who brought up the issues and how this. They called it even the nickname Lei Felca. That put limits on what you can do on these games, on the chat. So the kids that are under 16, they can't use the chat online mode anymore. And those are all things that are being implemented and that are causing a lot of noise. And I think, finally, one of the things that is extremely in, people are talking a lot in Brazil, but I think worldwide, is how these platforms harm children, also harm women, and especially how they create a type of, or instigate a type of behavior towards women, associated with the red pill movement, and which is insane. We had a case last 2 weeks ago of 4 high middle class children that raped a 17-year-old girl in an apartment, which was the ex-girlfriend of a friend of them. And these are not kids that are coming from the favelas. These are well-educated kids. One was a son of a subsecretary of state in Rio de Janeiro, studying in Pedro II, which is a highly qualified, supposedly left-wing school, So you see how far it's getting, and this violence against women, this is something that is worldwide. There's a movement of male influencers that instigate this behavior, this violent behavior against women. There's also a lot of non-consensual sharing of intimate images that is happening. And with using AI, and there's a very negative aspect about AI, there is more than 90% of AI-generated fake intimate videos target women. So this is a reality that we're living. And right now, in the Brazilian Congress, we have 2 laws that are being studied. One, to criminalize organized online misogyny, which is essential and is getting more and more company. And the other one is to require platforms to restrict accounts of those that spread gender-based hate. Because essentially Meta and Google and all of them, they're making money with this. That's the crazy thing, So not only do they alienate our kids, they make it easier for them to access videos about how to cut themselves, how to commit suicide. It's so simple. It's like somebody showed me the other day how in 5 clicks you can find a video on TikTok that shows you how to commit suicide at home. And this is something that is a worldwide problem. This doesn't restrict itself to the U.S. or to Brazil. It's a worldwide problem. Right now, for instance, last year, Australia became the first country to ban social media for children under 16. And, when I said that to my kids, like, I'm not going to live in Australia. Moving there. But it's, I think my kids got access to phones too early, and we didn't see what was happening. And I think especially in the pandemic, because people were so isolated, parents, the kids have class online, so they were already introduced to that environment. And suddenly these kids of this generation that were born after 2011, 2012, they're afraid of going out. They feel safer at home. They feel safer behind their screens, So this is really, a worldwide issue that we really have to look in carefully. The European Union voted in November that children should be at least 16 to access social media. The most restrictive proposal yet. It still needs to be validated by each country. Recently, Indonesia, that you were talking about, announced that new controls on Roblox, the game, as of March 2026. India and Indonesia are both active debating age restrictions. South Africa as well warned in March 2026 that it's going to ban alternative risk publishing young people in less regulated spaces. So this is something that is really taking the world. And just to finish, to take it back to the story of the verdict in Los Angeles and why it matters and why the change in law in Brazil for digital environments matters, is because each country is fighting this corporation. Each country is not fighting these corporations alone, right? Everybody is building and realizing that these companies they're evil, right? So there needs to be a global effort. And I think, as far as Global South Rising is concerned, the Global South, Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, maybe other countries of Latin America, we need to collectively represent, billions and trillions of people. Brazil was the country that uses Instagram the most worldwide. So we have an extraordinary leverage there if we use it together, So we need to look at examples of, what is called media regulation, people call it censorship, so that there are laws, so that we look careful at, these cases as addiction. It's, there's many psychiatrists that show that, social media addiction is something that is equivalent to, cocaine or crack addiction. It plays with same areas in the brain with the release of dopamine and the idea of instant gratification. So I think, this was, a small step, this jury, this trial in Los Angeles and New Mexico, but it's certainly a step in the right direction, and I think this conversation starts today, but we need to look into the future and be cautious and be able to talk to our kids, but also, talk to the governments and to these companies to really protect people, protect ourselves, because, I'm controlling myself now with this stuff because it is addictive, it is addictive.
So to put it in perspective, of course, yes, on one hand, China, of course, already implemented something called the minor. Do you remember last year there was a huge uproar in the Western media about China being so authoritarian because it was putting limits on usage, not just for social media, but also for gaming, online gaming, shopping, but any of these dopamine hit addictive things. So for kids, they do have limits, apparently under the age of 8, it's up to 40 minutes a day, and then no service from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Now remember, it's it is quite, it's not, yes, 8, it's very, very young, but the thing is it is multiple platforms. So it's not just social media. And then 8 to 15-year-olds is 1 hour. Again, no service from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then 16 to 17-year-olds is up to 2 hours. So they implemented it last year in 2005, and they're also introducing new classifications this year and targeting major platforms as well, basically next week. However, of course, on the other side, we're always going to have a conversation around whether or not this impedes freedom of speech or how it can be used to impede freedom of speech, because we have this on one side going, yes, it is to protect our minors, and that's definitely important. And then we have the Zionist lobby on the other hand going, we have to get rid of TikTok, or we have to control TikTok, or, trying to, really use this pretext for censorship. So how do we like reconcile those two things? What do you think?
Look, I don't think we should, TikTok is addictive. It's not because something is Chinese that it's perfect. I'm going to practice my active non-alignment here.
No, it's not Chinese. That's the point. That was always.
Yeah, but I'm on Chinese social networks. I'm on WeChat. I'm on Xiaohongshu. I see the content that there is there, and I'm sorry, there is a lot of content that is misogynist that also stimulates violence. So it's not totally perfect. I can show you an example on WeChat right now. I was surprised even. So it's not perfect. It's a worldwide issue, and Chinese officials have said it's an issue. There is an addiction. There's a teen addiction with social media in China as well. It's a worldwide problem.
That's not the discussion here, because the issue with China, like I said, it's not about, first of all, let's get rid of the perfect thing. Like, not to bring it out on you, Zhao, but people always say this, and it's just very, very, nobody's perfect. No country's perfect. No human is perfect. We're not dealing with a perfection. And China just introduces very strict regulations because it's in a centralized socialist system that has more controls for reasons that we've discussed. We've discussed this thing of the freedom of speech within a country that's trying to be sovereign shouldn't be absolute, because you have these external factors coming in. Like, you have hostile foreign factors like US propaganda, but also in these terms too, capitalist agendas that only rely on this sort of addictive dopamine hits to make money off of you. So that's also something that needs to be regulated. I would say, like, it proves that Chinese people and China is not perfect, and that's why they need these regulations, but it just proves they're human. Like all of us, we need certain types of regulations. But I guess the question is, like, here, is there danger? There is definitely danger here of them using this as a pretext to do genuine censorship on us. But I guess that's just the question, that's the discussion that I think still needs to be had.
Yeah, I think that the thing, censorship is one thing, right? The other thing is not to have regulations at all. We have laws for what happens. This was a big discussion we had last year, and Lula even talked about that. We have laws that are applied in every country outside of the internet, right? The internet cannot be a no man's land where these laws don't apply. That's not censorship, So yes, it can be used as an excuse to, and function as censorship in the end. And that's why we have to be cautious. But at the same time, if you had teenage kids, you'd think differently, because the harm that it's doing it to these kids, it's immense. And I see it on a day-to-day basis with my kids, with their friends, everywhere. There is a generation of children that are locked in the rooms, depressed, that are not willing to socialize, that have.
I definitely think it's. Yes, I don't have kids. However, that's not the point. I mean, I agree with you already. Regulation is necessary for just the fact of, like I'm saying, what you mentioned about the manosphere. I mean, it goes way beyond that, right? We're talking about a dehumanization of women and children, and also men. I mean, that is very, very scary. Like, men by men. It's like over 90% the perpetrators are men, but sometimes men are also victims, right? Or boys. But there's definitely something very wrong with the psychological effect of it, for sure. And I'm even seeing it with my dad, for example. It's not just children. I mean, no, sure. My dad is a depraved predator. What I'm saying is the addictive quality of social media. I don't think it's good for even brains, where they have, like, in terms of, like, older people. Sorry, Dad. Right? It would probably hurt their brain in terms of, like, development or.
Yeah. No, I've read an article exactly about that, how it's affecting the elderly. It's it's insane. Obviously, we think about the kids because it's the future, but I see it with my mom. She reads a lot, and she's a very Interesting person. Sara has met her.
She's wonderful. She's absolutely wonderful. She's like a person that is always actively outside in the militancy. She's not she's someone who is out there with the people on the streets. Although she was a wife of a diplomat for so many years, she's so humble and she's an incredible woman. Yeah.
But she's there on WhatsApp, and the problem was the elderly, particularly, is that they are susceptible to a lot of como é que fala golpe? Scams.
Yeah.
So it's crazy, it's really, if you think about these guys, Zuckerberg and Bezos and all these guys behind social media giants, and also the AI companies, what kind of humane values do they have when they know this?
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know if you saw the video. There was a video where the lawyer essentially forced Mark Zuckerberg to turn to the mother of these girls and ask, say he was sorry. And if you haven't seen it, you should look it up. But it's like he was really, not willing to do it. In the end, he did it, But it shows, that really profit is the most important thing, absolutely, for empire. It doesn't mean if this means violence against women. It doesn't matter if it's causing teenagers to be depressed and suicidal. It really doesn't. And in fact, there's another study which is rare. I think it's an MIT study. I'm not going to say guarantee it's 17, but I read it as well. It's a 2025 study that shows that this generation is the first generation in 100 years that is going to be dumber than their parents. So the past 100 years, no, it's true. In the West, it's true. It's sad. I have kids that age. Look, it's really a problem. It's really a problem because they're the future, and they're the ones who are going to either, go with the empire or go with someone else. Young boys now feel, there's a general worldwide, young boys now feel women should be at home and do women tasks, like more than 50, almost 60%. So there's something that is an architecture behind the social media and the AI that is forming people, to be easily manipulated, less intelligent, less critical thought, better consumers, and people that believe in conspiracy theories. Social media is great to spread conspiracy theories. It's like it does so much harm. With girls, the aesthetic. My daughter has that issue. She has distorção de imagem. I don't know how to say this.
Yeah.
Huh?
Does she have body dysmorphia?
Yeah, exactly. So she's like super skinny, and it's all because of social media. It's all, and it's her friends. I see it all around. This is a pandemic of sorts. And it was actually, it really became stronger after the pandemic, where everybody was at home behind their cell phones. I don't have an answer, but it needs to be regulated somehow, and it's not censored.
I think the comment section making some good points here. Yeah, I do think one needs to be regulated. I think that makes sense. Two, breaking up the monopolies. I think that's imperative, isn't it? And then I think the third thing too is social media cannot be a substitute for how terrible our education is, and as with the decline of US empire, the sort of push towards a more undereducated, more stupid, frankly, population. That's an intentional push. They want people to be more ignorant so that people don't understand what their governments are doing to their population, don't understand that the governments are responsible. So
yeah, and I would add to that, Lise, an element. Let's call what they are. They are not big techs. They are mass surveillance companies using AI for genocide, using AI for targeting a school of Iranian girls. I mean, it came out, it was AI decision. So these are not big techs, they're big mass surveillance system, war systems. Social media, it's a way of gathering information as well, selling this information to the Utah Black Box, which is being expanded. So we are delivering highly personal information. We don't have the right to delete it. We don't have, these people are having a editorial authority upon our consciousness.
Well, also the data mining is a huge thing. You know, that should be illegal to sell our data. I know China, again, has regulations on that, you know, corporate data mining and the sale of it. But essentially, all of it comes down to, and it's ridiculous that children can be the victim, like children can be in sacrifice of capital gain, because that's all they care about.
I mean, violence is a commodity. Violence today is a huge commodity.
Exactly. They don't care, really. It just shows that they don't even care about their own children. Well, they probably
they
care.
want it. They want it. They long for it. They incite it because it is a commodity.
Yeah, it's just capital gains. That's all they care about. Okay. So I guess we've sold everything. No, we haven't. But yeah, it comes back to the same thing again. But I am at least hopeful. Zhao, do you want to finish your watch? Because I always feel like you finish with something positive.
No, I mean, as I said, I think there are movements worldwide, as we saw with the new ECA and the FELCA law in Brazil, that are moving towards regulating this. And I think, you know, as you said, China has been one of the precursors in this movement. But certainly Australia and New Zealand, they've already banned it for social medias for kids under 16. And, you know, maybe that's what we need to do, because we're losing our kids. You know, they're locked in their rooms. They're not reading. They have very short attention spans. So we need a regulation. It's coming. I think this, you know, I think I started on a positive note. You know, Zuckerberg was pledged guilty. You know, I think so. I'll finish in a circle. Zuckerberg guilty.
Yeah. So let's see what happens to the 2,000 other pending cases in the US. Let's see. Anyway, so moving on to Sarah's watch. Should we move on?
So my watch is specifically about the Congo motion, but I could, I could not fail to report on that, which is Venezuela. So I'm just going to do a brief summary of this article. Yesterday, 26th of March, was the second court hearing of Venezuela President Nicolas Maduro and first combatant Fidel Flores. It was held in New York. And what we need to remember, they have been for 83 years in detention, wrongful detention, hijacked. They were forcibly taken from Caracas in an operation the 3rd of January. They bombed Venezuela, US bombed Venezuela, caused dozens of deaths, and hijacked him to the US territory. And Trump cannot even hold to the script why he got Maduro. First it was Cartel de los Soles, and then they decided this cartel doesn't exist. We know Venezuela has a infamous contribution to the drug trafficking passage or production. And yesterday it's very important because at the center of the hearing was a dispute that about funding. Well, what is so important about funding? Well, the US prosecution said Venezuela cannot fund Maduro's defense. He's the president of Venezuela, so the government can fund his hearing, his defense, without being sanctioned. And this has a huge impact. If you cannot fund your defense, how you have a right to a fair trial? How do you have the right to a full defense? So the judge, actually was interesting. The judge, Hellenstein, questioned this attempt to block Venezuela for paying the defense, saying, look, there is no concrete national security threat to justify such restriction. And this judge, he signalized he might allow access to the funds. So it is a victory. We know the defense of Maduro is led by Barry Pollack, who also was very effectively representing Julian Assange. I have to say, probably the most effective lawyer he had. And I was Barry Pollock's negotiation that led to release of the Julian Assange. So Pollock has been arguing that the Venezuelan constitutions guarantee the right to a properly funded and freely chosen defense. And meanwhile, the prosecution of the US, it was treating like a sanction and a national security threat when we need to block those funds. I think we showed the document here. So it's just showed, and also the thing with the cartel of the sun, there's a huge fragility in the case. The Department of Justice had already stepped back from asserting that such a group exists, and but we see Trump again doubling down, escalating pressure, and saying that new charts could follow Maduro. And I think we're not talking enough about Venezuela. We are not talking about the international solidarity owed to Venezuela. And yes, so we also have to say that over like 4 million Venezuelans recently participate in the national consultation, according to this news. And silently, they continue to support the Bolivarian revolutionary process. So I think it's very important that we talk about Venezuela. If it was in my watch, I'll try to be a bit brief in my real watch now.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll put in the links to the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign for the UK, but I'm sure it links to other things in our description in a bit. But go ahead, Sara. What is your watch for this week?
Well, so we've seen that the UN General Assembly adopted a Ghana-led resolution recognizing that the transatlantic slavery is the gravest crime against humanity. This is huge. And it passed, although the US, of course, Israel and Argentina blocked, and a lot of countries abstained. Let me read the countries that abstained. I think it's very impressive. The lack of moral authority. Yeah, but we had Albania, we had, of course, we had Britain abstaining as well. Britain from all countries. I have the list here, just can't find it right now. Well, but back to that. What does it mean legally? Well, we know the General Assembly resolution, they are not binding, so declarations. So they do not, you cannot through a declaration compel a state to pay reparations, to establish a tribunal, to take any specific action. And I think under the UN Charter, only the Security Council resolution adopted has a binding effect in international law. Nevertheless, I think, well, with legally, the General Assembly has expressed a collective political statement and will of some state. And I think to have this resolution, it strengthens the architecture for reparation of claims, for the consciousness as well, for the political consciousness, putting the right name of things. And it does provide a authoritative, let's say, platform for advocacy within the UN. And they create a soft case law and opinio juris. It adds weight. It adds weights to existing frameworks of reparations, of arguments. So directly has no legal effect, but it does have a readjustment effect, let's say. So opinio juris, what is this? So when you have repeat General Assembly resolutions in the same subject, so you can create what you say customary international law, saying, okay, this is how it should be. And over time, if those resolutions are consistent, they can harden into a binding costume. Yeah. In particular, when they have this near universal effect or as a consensus. So this has a relevance. And that's why Israel, West, and Argentina and some European states are legally not wanting abstaining or opposing because it weakens the effect of a consensus, the effect of a opinion juris. So when you say we have persistent objectors or we have here people stepping back, abstaining, it does have an effect to prevent this to harden into a customary law. So it's relevant, the abstention. And we have here soft law pressure resolutions. They can shape the treaty, they can shape negotiations, they can shape domestic law, interpretation, jurisprudence of international courts and human rights bodies. So it is significant. It is significant to talk about slavery being the hardest or the most severe crime against humanity. It does carry weight. It does carry eventually legal consequences. Under the principle of what I said, you use cautions when which is important, because crimes against humanity, there's no justification for it. There's no derogation. There's no defense. So it's really it's quite a thing. That would, from that, you could say, well, if there is a right to obligation, this will be non-derogable, means no, there's no defense for it. Statutory limitations will not bar claims arising from it. And you can also talk about what you call residual responsibility of successor in the state. So it's quite an interesting ruling. It's really important. I have here a video of the Ghanaian president, John Dramani Mahama. He is speaking at the United Nations, New York, criticized the US for normalizing the erasure of Black history and warned about such policies. And I have to say, the way America dealt with the Black resistance is insane. You know, how they assassinated the Black Panthers, how they tortured them. So it has a very contemporary meaning, because in many places slavery hasn't ended. At least the echoes of the slavery are very present. So let's see here. Maybe we should watch a bit of what the Ghana president is saying.
Here in the United States, Black history courses are being removed from school curriculum. Schools are being mandated to stop teaching students about the truth of slavery, segregation, and racism in American history courses. Books about these topics are being banned in schools and public libraries. Museums, art centers, and other institutions whose budgets rely in any way on public funds are being prohibited from scheduling exhibitions and programs, or from displaying materials promoting racial awareness or Black history. Much like the law that was put in place to regulate the punishment of the enslaved in Barbados, these policies are becoming a template for other governments as well as some private institutions. At the very least, they're slowly normalizing the erasure. They're slowly normalizing erasure.
So I think it's for me, I think one of the most striking things is that in the meantime, Israel continues to receive Holocaust reparations from Germany, with total payments exceeding 18 billion over the decades, alongside billions paid annually in pensions and support for survivors, which is correct. But Germany still allocates over $1 billion a year compensations warfare for Holocaust survivor, making one of the largest running reparations program in modern history. But we know how also Germany chose to make reparations to the Holocaust, which is the biggest supporter of the Palestinian genocide, Israel arms trade. Germany has been a consistent, willing supporter, and if not accomplice, like we saw the Nicaragua case against Germany. Germany is actually complicit in this genocide. I have here a list of the countries that have abstained. I think we should name them: Albania, Andorra, Armenia, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Cambodia, Canada, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Fiji, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Monaco, Montenegro, Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Oman, Palau, Paraguay, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Moldova, Romania, San Marino, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, and United Kingdom. And I mean, we need to talk about the British involvement in the slave trade. You know, it was not a private commercial venture that the crown just tolerated. It was authorized, profitized, chartered by the monarchy. The British monarchy, I would say, they're the largest one of the largest slave traders in the entire world. They began in the 16th century and they just stopped because of the Industrial Revolution. It was not so profitable anymore. They were a dominant enslaving nation responsible for transporting at least 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. And this is when we talked about just the direct involvement of Britain. You know, Britain, what they would do, they would take the manufactured goods, textile, guns, alcohol to West Africa. They would exchange for enslaved people, and they would ship across the Atlantic to Latin America in horrific conditions. And those boats were loaded with colonial procedures, especially with gold. They don't say this a lot, but in the Caribbean, in America. So Britain also ransacked Latin America massively. And we, nevertheless, last we forget is Portugal was the pioneer of the transatlantic slave trade, abstained. Portugal has abstained. Portugal began the systematic trafficking of enslaved Africa in 1440, you know, even more a century than Britain. And I have to say, Portuguese established the whole foundational infrastructure for the slave trade. Brazil is the single largest destination of enslaved Africa in the entire world, 10 times more than the US has received. Brazil is built on the blood, on the tears of enslaved people. So this trade continued really, really late. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery. It was 1888. And the British capital was deeply embedded in the Lisbon merchant houses. So Britain would give to Portugal slaves in exchange for the gold. So Britain and Portugal were hand in hand as the largest slave traders of planet Earth, unprecedented. And the royal family is heavily involved. Yeah, the British court always protect its court, the Portuguese, in doing this. So it's direct intervention. So I would say it's crazy. It's not crazy, but how can King Charles apologize for the slave trade? How can people in the UK study history until they are 13 and then never be confronted again with the exploitational and imperialist past? If you go to, like when we're working in the British government, you'd say highly educated Oxford, Cambridge people did not know anything about the history of the British Empire, about slavery. How can that be? You know, this is a perpetuation of injustice. This is a perpetuation of the echoes of slavery, racism, deep-seated racism. So well done to Ghana. Here we have again a global south. The history of the anti-colonial Africa is heavily underestimated, is heavily not studied. The anti-colonial movements in Africa, which Cuba was so important to raise. We should talk more about that. Amazing resistance from the African. We see now in Sahel also the amazing resistance in the anti-colonial. And we should celebrate Ghana's resolution. And I think will come more.
I think also what it does, show about the UN is for example, people always saying, well, if the UN, like you're saying, if it's not a legally binding resolution, what's the point of it? And the point is we need to understand where these countries really fall in terms of the imperialist system, understanding the imperialist system more, the people that are responsible for these types of genocides, and the fact that they've never been held accountable. This document, this resolution, shows us why. Like, so if we look again at the three countries that voted against: US, Israel, Argentina. Obviously, Israel and US, like we said, US is really an extension of US empire, so that's no surprise at all. Argentina, a right-wing, basically self-proclaimed anarchic capitalist, whatever that is. Millet, he's sucking up to the US. This is clearly him aligning with US imperial interests. The 52 countries that abstained, if, you know, I'm showing this graphic here because this is the Tricontinental Research Dossier on Hyperimperialism. Again, I'm mentioning it again, but here they're showing the US-led imperialist camp of 49 countries. Out of the 52 countries that abstained, only one country actually voted for this resolution, and that was New Zealand, because New Zealand has its own reparational system, official one, with their indigenous population, the Maori population. But so the rest of the global north countries all abstained, and that's because they're guilty within this framework of slavery, genocide, and colonialism. So this is why we still need the UN, because as the new multipolar world emerges more clearly, we're going to be able to act upon the record of these countries, right? Like maybe now we're not really in the position to have legally binding situations, resolutions, but down the line, you know, like you said, it's paving the way for a more official arrangement. For reparations down the line.
Yeah, and I think what is very important to understand that in the UN, abstention is not a neutral position. Never been, never will be. And one product effect is that if you object, and if you consistently object, you can't create a customary international law, which is legally binding. So it's very purposeful, this abstention. And it's incredible that in this day and age, you can say slavery is okay. The slave trade is okay, because when you abstain, you're saying slave trade is okay.
I mean, the US even said that they don't recognize, like they don't recognize historical, what was it called? They basically said because it was not against the law when it happened at the time.
Yeah.
That therefore it's fine. Like, therefore they're not going to acknowledge.
Yeah, the indigenous genocide is fine when you colonize, because nulla pena sine lege, no law before legislation. Well, you can choose here. You are doing the legislation, so you can choose. This argument is absolute bogus. You can choose to say, okay, back then we didn't have a system, but we condemn now, and we condemn even retrospectively, because slavery is against human dignity. It's against the core of humanity. It's degrading. So this is such a disgusting motherfuckery argument.
So why do you think they abstain? Because the easy moral answer would be not to abstain, right? So what do you think is behind the abstention, really?
No, but I mean, they can't be in favor of it because they don't agree with it. And also they are part of that system, right? They don't want to go directly against the US.
I think it's a great question. I asked myself, why did they abstain? Because morally it's unsustainable in their society, ethically absolutely unsustainable.
But that's why they abstained.
Yeah, I want to just play devil's advocate here. I would say they abstain so they're not eventually liable for anything.
Yeah, that's why they abstain.
That's it. They're not gonna. There's no other reasoning, because morally the easy answer is not to abstain, right? So if they're abstaining,
but morally, what do you mean by that? Because obviously they're not gonna
look. In such a, it's so clear what the correct ethical answer is. right?
Yeah, I mean, that's why they abstained, because they're guilty as fuck. Sorry. And they don't want to be held liable, as you said. They're complicit within the system, active participants. So, I can't imagine them, like, I guess my point is I would be more shocked if they voted in favor, I guess.
Yeah,
But it's not about being shocked. I think it's important, as you said, the UN still has a role. It's an important role, I think. As much as the US wants to diminish it, it serves a purpose. Obviously, the countries in the global south have been fighting to reform the UN Security Council and to give more voice to, global south countries, which I think is necessary because it's still designed on a post-Second War system. But it still acts as, and especially with the US, being so voracious now, I think it is a very important voice. And in a situation like this, I ask myself, because unless it's for the liability, morally, why would they, the ethical answer is so easy. I can only think that, they're afraid of being liable. Countries say, okay, so you think it was wrong, you're going to have to pay. I don't know. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense for me, because this is not just somebody's will. It's a state's decision, and it implies in its image towards its citizen and towards the rest of the world. That's why I ask. I don't know if that's the answer, but why? I still ask why. Why did they abstain? What do they gain with that? Really?
It makes sense because abstention here is politically unattainable, unsustainable. Let's say, how can you turn to your citizens and say, well, we think it's okay. We think slavery is not a crime against humanity. We think it is really okay. You can't do that. You cannot do it in Europe. You cannot do it in Australia. So the political cost is huge. So I think you're probably right there. We want to avoid any type of liability in relation to Africa, because we're still exploiting them. We still want the free road to exploit and go there and enslave children in cobalt mines to do our fucking iPhones. Yeah. Mm-hmm. To Nestle to produce chocolate with slavery child work. For me, this shows that slavery, it's not history. Slavery is reality. And they are still slave holders. Europe is still slave holders. American are still slave holders. And we should be really aware not to consume anything from this slavery chain. If you see the reports on the cobalt mining of children, it's absolutely scary. They are still slave owners. And I think there's this, we don't want a reparation. And we need to stop slaving Africa. That's the message that they are sending. And so I think we should rise and condemn these 50 motherfuckers against this abstention, pretending there is any type of neutrality here, which there isn't. I wonder why the movements, the social movements here in the UK, in the US are not protesting this. This is a typical thing you should go on the streets for. This should be really scaring the shit out of people. And this is a huge opportunity to oppose neocolonialism. It's very interesting how this news didn't have the political reading it needs to have by movements that are specialized in this.
Well, I mean, I think maybe the argument for them is that there's so many things happening, right? But I think, again, the clarity that's needed in this particular case is if we notice the countries that voted for the resolution, all the so-called U.S. enemy of state countries are on the for, you know what I mean? Russia, North Korea, China,
Brazil,
Cuba, like Venezuela. No, because Venezuela is not part of the UN at the moment. I mean, they have some unpaid dues or something. But essentially, all the enemy of states, the so-called U.S. enemy of states, are on the right side. So that should tell somebody something, tell the population something about this scenario.
Yeah, and their abstention are absolutely scandalous.
Yes.
It's an attack on human rights, this abstention. It's an attack on humanity and human dignity in this day and age. To abstain, when you're talking about slavery,
it is absolutely a confession, is what it is.
yeah,
It's a confession.
a confession that they are still enrolled and actively participating in slave trading in Africa, slave work in Africa, colonial practices in Africa. This is a confession. This is a full-blown confession, and I'm very surprised that we are not going the streets against this.
Yeah, I actually found an article here on passblue.com that says exactly that the European representatives expressed concern that the resolution could imply in retroactive legal obligations, noting that reparations claim are incompatible with established principles of international law because, as you said, slavery was not illegal under international law at the time it occurred.
That's what the
It's
U.S.
far more than illegal is against human dignity. It's
That's
against humanity.
official statement. Can you imagine a country that will say that officially? That tells you all we need to know about the U.S.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, okay, well, I think that's really important. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I think that's really important for us to pay attention to, even while people say, what's the point of the UN? We now know what the point of the UN is. And I do think it's going to get more and more important, more and more relevant as, things start to change. But I guess we'll move to our watch. I guess we are so over time again. We try to get this to 2 hours. We're 2:30. So I'll try to get through this quickly. But the Philippines has been the first country to declare a state of energy emergency, a national energy emergency. And I want to, of course, on my watch, talk about how this is not an isolated incident. It's really a case study of what happens to a nation when it completely subjugates itself to U.S. imperialism. It's important for us to, I've already sort of mentioned this, but it's important for us to pay attention, or at least understand, that when basically every country in the world right now is facing immense U.S. pressure. And a country like the Philippines, which is a de facto U.S. military base, is under even more pressure than other global South countries. Really, the Philippines and the other country is South Korea. But we'll get into how South Korea is dealing with that, because we still need to acknowledge, while the pressure is so immense and the limitations of movement is so immense, is so limited, that there's still room to maneuver. So I'm just going to go into, So basically, first of all, the reasons why they are declaring this state of national energy emergency, the three main reasons are that the Philippines is exceptionally vulnerable to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. They get 98% of its crude oil.
Ooh, 98.
Yeah, from petroleum products, and 90% of that are sourced directly from the Middle East. So that's one thing, right? They're extremely vulnerable in that way. They also have no nationalized oil industry and no strategic petroleum reserves, because they had an oil deregulation law in 1998, and that means that the government's hands are really tied here. They only have a buffer stock of 45 days, and these are all held by private companies because there's no nationalized oil. And then 3, their renewable energy accounts for about 32% of their power generation, and their grid only covers 94.8% of households, meaning 1.4 million families still live in the dark. And that means that obviously this is a society that's very much fragile, on the cusp, essentially. They also have a really huge poverty rate, which I'll get into. In terms of their registered electric vehicles, they only have almost 42,000 vehicles. Only 42,000 vehicles are EV registered as of September 2025. And that's out of 15 million registered vehicles. That's only 0.29% of vehicles on the road. So this is why, they're so incredibly dependent on oil and on external exports of oil. And again, this is precisely the type of thing that a capitalist neoliberal system that US imposes on countries, right? It is a system absolutely designed for development, not for development, but for perpetual subjugation. And of course, the Philippines is particularly of importance to the US because it is part of the first island chain. So like we just look here, that's the Philippines. I don't know if I'm actually showing, but you can see where the Philippines is, right? Like that's above Malaysia there. So it's particularly significant in terms of that way. And obviously, well, not obviously, but maybe it's not obvious to most people, but as I just said, it's a de facto US military base. So it means that there are now 9 joint US military sites. They actually call them Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which is obviously not defense. But this is joint training with the US. The US can store advanced weaponry on these bases, and they have unimpeded access to these weapons. They can use them unilaterally from the Philippines. Obviously, the Philippines is striking distance to China. So that's the strategic importance of the Philippines. And within this, of course, the US creates this escalation against China using the Philippines, positioning sort of psychological warfare tactics, like creating in the Philippines this idea that they're being victimized by China, that China is a huge threat to them, that China is trying to colonize them. You hear that all the time from a lot from Filipino populace because they're hugely propagandized by the US, and they're also hugely undereducated. So we have that. But I just wanted to put this up here because I did just mention South Korea. And I want to say, like, even though it's absolutely horrific what is happening in the Philippines, right? Like, we're talking about a country that was colonized under the Spanish for 450 years and then colonized by the US for 50 years, and now is under basically a de facto US imperialist, is a US imperialist colony. So it's just a change in what the colonization looks like, but it's really still in that colonial mentality. And I think that's like particularly significant. But so if we look at here though, oh no, as if I'm really bad at this. Let's see if I can just show this. If we look at what's happening in South Korea, also a US de facto, oh my God. Okay. It's also a US de facto military colony, as if I can't figure out how to do this. Okay, here you go. It's not allowing me to do this. Sorry. Remove. Here you go. Okay, so the president of South Korea, Lee Jae-myung, here he is over here. He has just said on, I think today, that the country would seek to reclaim wartime operational control from the US. So this is just an example of, I think, this is a good step for Korea, because right now the US controls their wartime military, their military. And just imagine, okay, just for a minute, what that means. Like, another country controls your quote unquote wartime military. That means they completely control you and they completely control your military. But he's actually moving to try to remove that. So again, it's like you're in the cage of US imperialism, but there are places to try to move. And I think it's like very important for us to hold accountable the Global South leaders that, are going to use the excuses of, oh, but the US is like too powerful, whatever, versus like the actual task, which is to be resisting US control as much as possible, and to be strengthening ties with regional actors. So in terms of the Philippines, this year they are chairing ASEAN, and they should be strengthening ties with other ASEAN countries. They should be strengthening ties with China. Because obviously, as we know, China is the leading green energy provider. So that could obviously help with the EVs. It could help with their electrical grid. But because of these escalations against China from the US, they have already basically lost out on specific things like infrastructure. They had a deal with China to be a recipient of high-speed rail that fell through. And during the time that it fell through, like a few years, basically they withdrew in 2023. But during that time, you know, Laos has built a high-speed rail. Indonesia has also had a high-speed rail. Thailand is under active construction. Even Malaysia has just resumed works and should be have a completion of high-speed rail in 2027. So the Philippines is really standing out as a country in Southeast Asia that's not utilizing the opportunities that are in their backyard or in their neighborhood, you know. And now we're seeing again, as they're sort of collapsing underneath this national emergency thing, which, you know, is they're putting in provisions that will only last 1 year. But they just started reviving talks with China to open the door for dialogue, just opening the door for dialogue.
Oh, right now, why?
Yeah, just opening the door for dialogue in terms of the offshore drilling, the, you know, the oil talks, what's it called? The offshore drilling, basically, and exploration of the South China Sea for oil. And China, so this is on March 24, China said it's opened the door to dialogue on the joint oil and gas development in the South China Sea. It remains open, but told the Philippines it must first demonstrate sincerity before negotiations can resume. All right. And then, but, you know, they're setting aside differences and pursuing joint development is the right path to uphold peace and stability in the South China Sea and deliver benefits to countries in the region and their people. That's what the Chinese embassy's official statement said. But of course, just yesterday, the Philippines and France have signed a visiting forces agreement that would allow them to conduct a joint military training in each other's territory. That is obviously an escalation in the South China Sea against China, right? Because obviously you now have not only US joint military exercises in that region, but you also have France, you know, in that region. So it's obviously trying to encircle China. And we do have to remember that this little part, I just want to talk about who is the president, just a little bit. The president, Marcos Bongbong Jr., he's a clear U.S. puppet, but not only is he a U.S. puppet, he is also the son of the dictator, Marcos Sr., that under the anti-communist push, you know, the Cold War anti-communist push, he was an anti-communist that killed an estimated over 3,200 people. There was widespread torture. There was martial law enacted on the Philippines from 72 to 81. He also
very corrupt as well, right? Very corrupt.
He also absconded with they're estimating $10 billion in public funds. He embezzled that from the Philippines. And he imprisoned over 70,000 political opponents and, you know, probably quote unquote communists. So he's the son of this dictator, this well-known US puppet that fled to Hawaii and died there after he was removed from the Philippines due to like a huge swell of people's power. So that's who we have as the president of China, and China as the president of the Philippines. So to end on that, I was trying to think of a positive thing, and I have nothing, but I would just say, like, the positive thing is that there is room. We have to recognize that there is room to maneuver. Like, if we actually break down what has led the Philippines to this place, we can actually see that it is preventable, that there were things that they could have done, that they can still do, perhaps, that would sort of protect them from this type of like geopolitical implications.
I thought it was very interesting that you brought that up, and especially because I saw a film actually when I was in Havana. It unites Eduardo and also my social media talk. about how Marcos Jr. came to power and how he was elected. And it was very similar to Bolsonaro in 2018. So they followed the Bannon recipe with social media and fake news. And it played in the 2023, I think it was in 2022, the election there. But, you know, he was elected using those tactics of, you know, unregulated social media, fake news. So it's just interesting how that
the thing that's really difficult here in terms of the political and the propagandic landscape in the Philippines is that really, you know how the US backs multiple candidates in an election. So I think that was kind of the problem, that even people that are aware of US interference into the Philippines, thinking that Bongbong might be someone that would stand up against the US because his vice president was, of course, Sara Duterte, which is the daughter of the previous president, who was not pro-China, but he was not pro-China, but he was someone that was trying to be neutral. He famously called Obama a CIA stooge and a son of a bitch. So like he was, not trying to, he had very strong rhetoric against the US, but honestly, he was, when you look at his policies and what he was actually doing, he was more neutral than pro-China. But obviously the US is going to view him as like pro-China because of his rhetoric, and because if you're neutral, they kind of perceive you that way. So there were other factors for why he was elected, but unfortunately it was just like the most terrible choice, basically. So.
Yeah. He's the son of Imelda Marcos, right? The one who used to dress up really fancy and was kind of scandalous.
Thousands of shoes. Yes, that's who he's the son of. So yeah, so actually Marcos Sr. was found guilty in 1995 by the U.S. federal court for libel for human rights abuses, and he was he was dead by that time, but I guess his estate was supposed to pay $2 billion to the victims. And of course, the victims' families had a really hard time collecting. And so I do think like it's really horrific because obviously Imelda Marcos and now Bongbong Jr. have been benefiting from this money. I just allegedly, right? Like, because they're still in politics, they're still prominent in the Philippines. So it's just, it's a horrible situation. But I just hope that more Filipinos actually wake up to what's actually happening. I mean, whenever I do social media on the Philippines, there are people in my comments that are just absolutely so angry at me because they think that the US is protecting them. And I'm like, they're not protecting. Please stop. So
yeah, that's part of the show. Some people will get angry.
Yes, absolutely. Anyway, so we've had a really long show today, and we can wrap up, I guess. Like, luckily it wasn't as long as last week, but next week we'll try to keep it to our 2 hours that we've been like, that's kind of what we're supposed to be doing.
Okay.
But yeah, any last words?
No, I really hope that Philippines find a way. I think it's funny. It's funny how the right wing is so strong, and I think Global South needs to find ways to it's not just the social media, by the way. We need to see how this is affecting the whole world and helping the extreme right grow everywhere, and manipulative politicians such as Bongbong and Bolsonaro, which are Washington's puppets, Milei, to still rise. So how can we use, because we have these tools, and I think we're doing it here, but how can we use these tools to help raise people's consciousness instead of making them dumber? I think that's a little bit of our role. And to finish a little bit on a positive, hopeful end for this weekend. Thank you, guys. Sara and Ileana. It was always great. It's always great.
It was great to be with you guys today.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for watching, everyone.
Great weekend. Bye-bye.
Everyone, have a good weekend. We'll see you next week. Okay, cool.